What if every time they hurt you, they weren't just lashing out, they were begging you to carry the weight of their wounded soul? And what if your reaction was the very prize they were hoping for? There's a moment, subtle, sharp, and strangely familiar, when someone says something that cuts a little too close. Maybe they disguise it as a joke. Maybe it's wrapped in concern. Maybe it's a quiet withdrawal that says, "You are the problem." You feel it like a drop of ink in clear water. Your gut tightens, your chest contracts, your mind races to defend, explain, prove. But what if I told you their words were never really about you? Carl Jung once said, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." Yet the inverse is also true. Everything someone throws at you in anger, judgment, or cold detachment is more often a mirror of what they cannot bear to see within. There is a quiet violence in the way people project. It's not always loud, it doesn't always leave bruises on the skin, but it leaves bruises in the psyche, and if you're not careful, it convinces you to mistake their shadow for your identity. You see, most people aren't at war with you. They are at war with the parts of themselves they refuse to meet, the rage they were told to suppress, the wounds they never tended to, the shame they buried beneath performance and pretense. When they lash out, it's not personal, it's psychological outsourcing. The tragedy? You become the vessel. You hold their pain. You carry their projections. And somewhere in the blur of confusion, you start to question your own worth. Jung called this the shadow, the part of the psyche that holds all the things we have rejected, denied, or disowned. And when someone refuses to look inward, they look for a canvas, someone to hold the mess they won't acknowledge, and that someone is often the person who triggers their buried truth. You. But here's the twist. Here's where the story begins to change. What happens when you stop reacting? When you don't explain, defend, or retaliate? What happens when you meet their unconscious with silence, not weakness, but presence? That, Jung believed, is where your real power lives. Not in controlling them, not in punishing them, but in breaking the mirror. So they are forced to see what they've become. This is not a story about vengeance. It is a journey into individuation, becoming who you truly are, apart from the roles and projections others place on you. And that begins with one truth. You are not the villain in someone else's unresolved story. Now breathe. You've already taken the first step. It feels unnatural at first, doesn't it? To stay still when every nerve in your body screams to react. To say nothing when your dignity feels bruised. To offer no correction when someone's narrative distorts who you are. But in that restraint, there is power. Because when you do not engage, when you refuse to play the part they have unconsciously assigned to you, something unspoken but unmistakable happens. The projection breaks. Carl Jung warned us that most people will do almost anything to avoid meeting their own shadow, to avoid seeing the fear, jealousy, shame, or insecurity that simmers beneath their carefully managed persona. And when you stop absorbing their emotional vomit, they have no choice but to sit in their own. It's agonizing for them, because now they're left staring into a void, one they've spent their entire life trying to fill with blame. Your silence becomes a mirror, and what once felt like strength to them, lashing out, controlling, punishing, now collapses under the weight of its own illusion. Their script no longer works. Their performance no longer holds. You've stepped off stage. You've walked out of the theater entirely. This doesn't mean you've lost your voice. It means you've reclaimed it, reserved it for conversations that honor your soul, not bait your trauma. You speak when there's truth to be exchanged, not when your integrity is on trial in someone else's courtroom. And here's where something extraordinary begins to unfold. When you no longer give them what they seek, your reaction, the discomfort falls back on them. Not because you sought revenge, but because you broke the unconscious cycle they've always relied on to avoid responsibility. That is the quiet regret they will feel, not because you screamed louder than they did, but because you didn't scream at all, because you walked away from the chaos with grace instead of getting tangled in it. You see, their goal was never clarity, it was control. Their jabs were not questions, they were accusations masquerading as conversation, and your emotional pain. That was the trophy, but you didn't give it to them. You withheld what they craved, not out of malice, but out of wisdom. Because you've seen through the illusion now. This was never about you. Their projection was always about their own disowned self. And you? You've just done what most people never learn to do. You've broken the cycle. You didn't carry what wasn't yours. You didn't explain what needed no justification. You didn't let their storm define your sky. This is individuation. The sacred path of becoming who you are, no longer fractured by the wounds of others, no longer split between your truth and their distortion. Carl Jung believed that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But that privilege requires a choice: to stop performing, to stop defending, to stop bleeding for those who refuse to heal. And when you make that choice, not once, but again and again, something changes. Not just in them, but in you. You begin to live from a different center, a still, grounded place within you that no insult can shake, no lie can stain, no projection can pierce. You begin to live not from reaction, but from self-respect. That, my friend, is the regret they never saw coming. There's a strange kind of silence that falls when you no longer take the bait. It's not the silence of defeat. It's not the silence of suppression. It's the silence of someone who sees through the game and refuses to play. Carl Jung taught that projection is the unconscious mind's way of dodging responsibility. When someone cannot face their shame, their inadequacy, their buried anger, they cast it outward, onto whoever's nearby, especially someone who shines a light on what they've hidden. That's why people who are growing, healing, or simply living in alignment often become targets. Your wholeness threatens their fragmentation. Your peace destabilizes their chaos. Your quiet presence echoes too loudly against the hollowness they pretend not to hear. And in the face of that dissonance, their instinct is not to look inward. It is to make you the problem. But here's the truth that will free you, and maybe even save you. Their attack is not your identity. Their story is not your script. Their unhealed wound is not your responsibility to carry, nor to soothe. This is where most people get caught, in trying to prove their innocence, in pleading for understanding, in thinking that logic, empathy, or clarity will rewrite someone else's psychological defense mechanism. It won't, because they didn't misunderstand you. They needed you to be wrong. They needed you to be the villain. They needed you to be the container for the pain they didn't know how to metabolize. Jung believed that projection dissolves when one becomes conscious of it. But that consciousness cannot be forced upon someone from the outside. They have to meet it themselves, and they rarely do, until the mirror, you, steps away. When you stay silent in the face of provocation, you're not bottling up. You're stepping out of the cycle, out of the delusion, out of their unconscious dance. And it is in that space that the possibility of true change is born. Not because they've won, but because they've been left alone with the very thing they were trying to avoid, themselves. You see, your non-reaction is not passive. It is potent. It is disruptive in the most sacred way. It sends a signal, not of weakness, but of wisdom. It says, I will not carry what is not mine. It says, I know who I am. It says, this is where my responsibility ends, and yours begins. This is how you make them regret it, not by matching their volume, not by explaining your side of the story for the 100th time, but by choosing not to be a character in their unresolved inner war. By walking away, not in bitterness, but in clarity. You don't punish them with your absence. You free yourself with it. And in doing so, you invite something deeper to emerge. Your individuation, your peace, your self-respect, finally unentangled from the distortions of others. That's not just psychological growth. That's soul liberation. But perhaps the greatest power lies not in how you walk away, but in how you choose to stay centered within yourself after you do. Because even in silence, the echoes of old wounds will try to pull you back. A glance, a memory, a question lingering like smoke. Did I do the right thing? But this is where the deeper work begins. Carl Jung taught that the shadow doesn't just live in others, it lives in you too. And once you stop carrying their projections, your own may rise. The part of you that wants to be liked, the child who needed to be understood, the ache to be seen as good, even by those who never saw you clearly. But here's where you anchor into your transformation. You were never meant to be everyone's piece. You were never here to heal what others refuse to touch. You are here to become whole, not to be palatable, not to be perfect, not to be the balm for someone else's storm. And this wholeness comes at a cost. The cost is letting go of roles that felt familiar, even if they were painful. The cost is disappointing others who only loved you when you stayed small. The cost is facing your own discomfort in the space where you no longer perform. But oh, what you gain in return. You gain clarity. You see who people are without the fog of your explanations. You gain peace, not the absence of conflict, but the absence of entanglement. You gain power, not over others, but within yourself. The power to choose stillness over reaction, silence over justification, boundaries over burnout. And maybe, just maybe, the ones who hurt you will feel the absence of your reaction like a mirror they cannot escape. They may not change, they may never apologize, but something in them will recognize the vacuum you left behind, the void where your energy once filled their need to project. And in that vacuum, they will sit, some in denial, some in discomfort, some, eventually, in realization. But that's not your journey to manage. Yours is to return, not to them, but to yourself. Because the true regret they feel will not be because you fought them. It will be because you didn't need to. It will be because you rose beyond the game. You became a mountain. You became the silence that speaks louder than any argument. You became the peace that needs no defense. Carl Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." And this sacred moment of choosing yourself over reactivity, presence over performance, clarity over chaos, this is what becoming truly yourself looks like. And in that, dear soul, there is no greater revenge than healing. There's something strange that begins to happen when you stop seeing the people who hurt you as enemies and start seeing them as souls who haven't yet faced their own pain. You don't forgive them to make them feel better. You don't show compassion to appear morally superior. You simply realize they don't know what to do with the parts of themselves that remain unhealed, so unconsciously they throw them at you. Not everyone who hurts you is bad. Many are simply wounded children in adult bodies. The cracks inside them never had names. Their anger, criticism, coldness, or manipulation doesn't come from malice. It comes from fear. And as Carl Jung said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. They don't realize what's controlling them, but you can. That is power. Not the power to retaliate, but the power to choose, not to react. Resistance doesn't make you stronger. It only shows that you're still caught in their psychological game. Every time you explain yourself, defend yourself, try to prove you're not the villain, they win. Because now, you're playing the role they've written for you, the one to blame, the one at fault. And that reinforces their identity as the victim. But when you don't react, not out of weakness, but from awareness, you create a vacuum. There's no one left to blame, no mirror to reflect their hidden pain. They're forced to confront themselves, or find someone else to carry it for them. This isn't easy. We live in a world that encourages us to speak up, fight back, never let anyone disrespect you. But there is a deeper form of justice, inner justice. No one can define your worth unless you give them the power to. You don't have to prove anything. You don't owe explanations to those who never intended to understand you. Conscious silence is a powerful act. It is the refusal to participate in a chaos that does not belong to you. It is the decision to turn inward and ask one simple question. What am I really protecting in me? Ego or truth? And the truth is, you don't need their understanding, their remorse, or their approval to find peace. Peace does not come from outside. It begins when you no longer fight to be seen. It begins when you know choosing not to react isn't indifference, it's evolution. It means you've chosen to guard your inner stillness, something no one can take from you unless you hand it over. The paradox: that stillness is the deepest mirror you can offer, not as punishment, but as invitation, to finally face the shadow they've spent a lifetime avoiding. When you stop reacting, you don't just remove yourself from the battle, you return to yourself, and in that sacred return, healing begins, not by forgetting, but by seeing things as they are, without labels, without judgment, without regret. Simply, that happened, and it no longer defines who I am, and in that, you are free. Thank you for walking this path with me to the very end. If this message resonated with your heart, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone else who's walking the road of self-awareness. You are not alone, and every time you choose consciousness, you light the way for someone else to do the same.